Dawn came gray and slow over the Sawtooth Range, and when Silas Marsh pulled open his cabin door that morning, he found the wolf standing 6 feet from his boots. She did not growl. She did not run. Her gray coat was crusted with frozen blood along the shoulder, and the leg beneath that wound hung crooked, useless, dripping a slow red line onto the snow. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she lifted her bad paw, just lifted it, the way a child lifts a hurt finger to a parent, and turned, and walked slowly toward the tree line. 3 steps in, she looked back at him over her shoulder. The look was not animal. The look was a question. And Silas, who had not spoken a kind word to anything living in 3 winters, felt something inside his chest crack open like river ice in April. He reached for his coat. He reached for his rifle. He reached last of all for the lantern, because somehow, even before he knew where she would take him, he understood that he was going somewhere dark. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand the man who answered the door. Silas Marsh was 49 years old that winter of 1888, and by every account of the few neighbors scattered through the valley below, he had been 49 for a very long time. He had come into the Sawtooths as a young trapper, light on his feet, light in the heart, with a wife named Hannah and the patient certainty that the mountains would feed them both. The cabin he built sat on a south-facing shelf above a creek that froze blue in January, and he carved Hannah's name into the lintel above the door the same week he laid the roof beam. He used to touch that lintel every time he came in from a trap line. He used to say her name like a small prayer. He did not do that anymore. Hannah had died 3 years before the wolf came, in the first hard week of November, in childbirth that went wrong in the small, slow way that childbirth went wrong on the frontier. Not a sudden tragedy, but a long one, hours of it, then a day of it, and then the silence that was worse than the screaming had been. The child, a girl, had lived 4 hours after her mother. Silas buried them together in a small clearing 100 yards east of the cabin, in a single grave because he could not bear to dig two. He marked it with a slab of river stone and the carved words, Hannah Marsh and her daughter, beloved. Every morning since that day, Silas had walked past that clearing on his way to check his traps. Every evening, he had walked past it again on his way home. He never stopped. He never knelt. He did not need to. The grave was inside him. In the 3 years since, his life had narrowed to the width of a snowshoe trail. He woke before dawn. He fed the small iron stove. He boiled coffee black enough to stand a spoon in, and he ate yesterday's biscuit in 3 bites without sitting down. He ran a trap line of 40 sets along the lower drainages, mostly marten and fisher and the occasional fox, and he skinned what he caught on a plank outside the cabin door so the smell would not get into his blankets. In the evenings he drank, not the wild drinking of a young man, but the slow, surface drinking of someone trying to keep a lid clamped tight on something that wanted out. A tin cup of whiskey, refilled 3 times, sometimes 4. Then sleep without dreams, which was the only mercy he asked for and the only one he reliably received. He had not gone down to the valley town in 18 months. He had not written a letter in 2 years. The pack train that came up the trail twice a season left him flour and salt and powder and bacon, took his furs in trade, and pretended not to notice the smell of an unwashed man and an unswept floor. He spoke to no one. He needed nothing. He had become, without quite meaning to, a kind of ghost wearing a body, and the body kept walking the trap line because that was what the body knew how to do, and the ghost kept staring out the cabin window at the clearing where the river stone stood, and the two of them, body and ghost, had agreed to leave each other alone. The day before the wolf came to his door, something had happened that Silas had almost forgotten by sundown. He had been moving up the south ridge to reset a fisher trap, and he had heard a rifle shot, not a hunting shot, a careless one, the kind a man fires when he is angry. He climbed the ridge and found a poacher, a thin man with a stranger's face and a stranger's gun, kneeling over a blood trail in the snow. The trail led off into the timber, fresh, bright, and the poacher was loading a second cartridge with hands that shook from cold or from greed. Silas did not like poachers. He liked them less when they shot animals and let them run. He had told the man, quietly, that he was on a registered trap line, and he could keep walking or he could explain himself to the marshal in Stanley. The poacher had cursed and spat and walked. Silas had watched the blood trail head north into the trees, had thought about following it, and had decided, because he was tired, because the light was failing, because he did not have it in him to care any more, to let the wounded animal go and die in its own way. He had walked home. He had drunk his whiskey. He had slept. He had not even once dreamed about the blood trail. And then the next morning, the blood trail came and stood on his porch. He understood almost at once. The shoulder wound was the right shape, the right side, the right height for the poacher's rifle. The wolf had carried that bullet through a night in the deep cold and dragged her bad leg the long way around the south ridge to find him. And now, she was lifting her paw at him and turning to walk into the trees. He stood in the open doorway for a count of 10, and in those 10 seconds he thought about every reason a sensible man should close the door, bar it, load the rifle, and shoot the wolf clean through the skull at 6 feet for the simple safety of doing so. Then he stepped out into the snow and pulled the door shut behind him, and he followed her. She did not lead him fast. She could not. She moved with the broken glass care of an animal in real pain, 3 legs and a fourth that touched down only when balance required it, and Silas kept 20 feet behind her so that his presence would not push her past what she could give. They went down the slope from the cabin, past the small clearing where the river stone stood, and Silas, who had walked that path 2,000 times, looked at the grave for the first time in 3 years and did not look away. And then they were across the creek, where the ice held under his snowshoes with the dry crack of a starched shirt, and up the far bank into the timber. He thought at first that she was taking him to a den he already knew. There was an old badger hole 1/2 mile up the north drainage that wolves sometimes used in deep winter. They walked toward it. They walked past it. She kept going. After another quarter mile they were on a contour Silas knew well, the long traverse below the cliff band that ran east toward the limestone, and he assumed she was taking him to the talus, where caves were possible, but he had never bothered to look. They walked along the cliff band. She did not turn into the talus. She kept moving east, slower now, the bad leg leaving a smear of red the size of his palm every 12 or 15 steps, and Silas found that he was counting those smears in his head, and he found that his hand was tight on the lantern handle even though he had not lit it yet, and he found, with a small surprised feeling that was almost the first emotion he had felt in 3 years, that he was afraid she would die before they got wherever she was going. She stopped at a place he did not recognize. It was a fold in the cliff he had walked past, by his own quick count, more than 200 times. There was a deep notch in the limestone where a seep had frozen across the rock face in a curtain of pale blue ice and thick brown vines, old grape, frozen fast, hanging like a beaded doorway from the lip above. He had glanced at that curtain 1,000 times and seen, every time, exactly what he was supposed to see, a wall. The wolf stepped behind the curtain and disappeared. Silas stood for a moment with his mouth open and his breath fogging around his beard. Then he pushed his shoulder against the vines, and the vines moved, and the wall behind them was not a wall. The cave mouth was wider than a man and taller than a horse, set so that the prevailing wind would never blow into it, hidden by the curtain and by the natural inward slope of the rock above. Silas struck a match against his thumbnail and put it to the lantern wick, and the soft yellow light fell forward into a passage that ran level and dry for 15 feet and then opened into a room. He took off his snowshoes. He set them by the entrance. He bent his head under the low arch, and he stepped inside. The air was the first thing. It was warmer, not warm, but warmer, somewhere in the low 40s, the kind of temperature his cabin held only at night with the stove banked. The second thing was the sound, a small, steady, musical drip of melt water from somewhere deeper in. The third thing was the floor. It was not stone. It was dry, packed earth scattered with a thick layer of last summer's bracken and old moss, the kind of bed a careful creature had been making in this place for years. The cave was a sheltered, hidden, alive thing, and the wolf had known about it her whole life. She had collapsed on a low mound of moss against the back wall, breathing in the shallow way of an animal that has finished its work. Silas raised the lantern, and then he saw what she had brought him to. 4 pups. 4 small gray shapes curled tight against her belly, eyes open, ears flicking at the lantern light, alive. They were maybe 3 weeks old, fat and clean and warm, and as he stood there with the lantern shaking in his hand, the smallest one yawned, a tiny pink yawn, and burrowed deeper against its mother's flank. Silas Marsh, who had buried his own daughter at 4 hours old, sat down hard on the cave floor and put his free hand over his mouth, and for the first time since November of 1885, he cried. He cried for a long time. He did not make a sound. The wolf watched him with her yellow eyes half shut, neither afraid nor reassured, the way a creature watches weather. The pup slept. The meltwater dripped. When he was finished crying, he set the lantern carefully on a flat stone. He took off his coat. He opened his small possibles bag, and he went to work on the wound in the wolf's shoulder. He worked for 5 hours. He cleaned the entry and the exit with melt water heated in his tin cup over a candle flame. He found the bullet. It had passed clean through the meat of the shoulder, missing the bone, missing the artery, the kind of luck that does not look like luck while it is happening. And he packed the channels with a poultice of pine pitch and powdered yarrow from a pouch in his bag, because that was what an old trapper named Boudreaux had taught him to do 25 years before, and because his hands remembered things his mind had given up on. The wolf flinched once when he pressed the pitch into the entry wound and showed him her teeth, a polite, almost apologetic showing, a reminder rather than a threat, and then she lay her head back down on the moss and let him finish. He bandaged the shoulder with strips cut from his own undershirt. He cleaned the bad leg as best he could. He set out a tin of cold venison from his pack within reach of her muzzle, and a second tin filled with melt water, and he sat back on his heels and breathed. It was somewhere in the long quiet of that breathing, somewhere in the strange new arithmetic of being a man inside a warm cave with a healing wolf and 4 sleeping pups, and a lantern that threw light onto walls he had not yet really looked at, that Silas raised his eyes for the first time and saw. The cave walls were covered in drawings. Charcoal. Soot. Some of them dark and crisp, some so old they had faded to the gentle gray of a long-rained ash. They covered every reachable surface of the back chamber from waist height to the curve of the ceiling. Wolves running in long lines along a ridge. Mountains drawn with the simple, certain strokes of someone who had walked their crests. Human figures with bows, with snowshoes, with packs on their backs. Stick rivers. Stick valleys. Whole stories of hunts and migrations and seasons, layered one on top of another like the pages of a book that had been written in by 100 hands across 100 years. Indigenous markings, Nez Perce, certainly Nez Perce. Silas had seen the symbols on bark and on hide, but never like this, never in a hidden mountain school of them. He stood up slowly with the lantern, and he walked along the wall, and his throat was so tight he could not have spoken even if there had been someone to speak to. He had walked perhaps 15 feet along the wall when his lantern light caught something different in the corner. It was an inscription, newer than the rest. Cut, not drawn, chiseled shallow into the soft limestone with the point of a knife, and the letters were English. Silas's hand began to shake before he had finished reading. He had to bring the lantern very close, and he had to read it 3 times, because the first 2 times his eyes refused to assemble the meaning of what they were looking at. Silas B. Marsh, 1841-1872. His grandfather's name. His grandfather's dates. The name on the marker behind the family farmhouse outside Lewiston. The marker his father had set in 1873 over an empty plot because there had never been a body to bury. Because Caleb Marsh had walked into the Sawtooth Range in the autumn of 1872 to finish a survey for the territorial government and had simply never walked out. For 16 years they had assumed an avalanche. They had told the children, Silas was a child then, 11 years old, that Grandpa Caleb had gone to map the high country, and the high country had taken him, the way the high country sometimes does, and there was no shame in that, only sorrow, and they should remember him as a man who had loved the mountains enough to die in them. Silas had grown up believing that story. He had carried that story into his own life as a trapper. He had built his cabin 3 valleys south of where his grandfather had vanished without ever quite admitting to himself that the geography was deliberate. And now 16 years and 30 miles later, he was holding a lantern up to a wall in a hidden cave that no living man had walked into in living memory, and his grandfather's name was carved into the rock at his shoulder. Silas sat down again on the cave floor. He sat for a long time without moving. The wolf on her bed of moss watched him with her steady yellow eyes, and the pup slept on, and the meltwater dripped, and outside the cave mouth the winter morning rolled forward into a winter afternoon that Silas did not notice and did not mark. When at last he stood up, he raised the lantern higher and he made himself look. There was a side cavity in the back wall, a natural cleft in the limestone, narrow at the front and roomier behind, the kind of pocket a careful man would use to store something he meant to keep dry. Silas knelt down and reached inside, and his fingers found leather, old, oiled, cured leather, and he pulled out his grandfather's pack. It was the same pack his grandfather had carried into these mountains in the autumn of 1872. Silas had seen it 100 times in boyhood photographs, and 100 more in his father's stories. The brass buckle on the front flap was tarnished green but unmistakable. The initials C.M. were burned into the leather along the strap. Silas opened the flap with hands that did not feel like his own. Inside the pack, wrapped in oilcloth, 3 thick leather-bound journals, a tin tube containing rolled survey paper, a small brass compass with its needle still trembling true, a stub of pencil, a folding knife, and tied separately, with a length of red thread, a sealed letter. The letter was addressed in his grandfather's careful, square handwriting. It said to Silas, "If found." He did not open the letter that day. He could not. He sat in the cave with the pack in his lap until the lantern flame began to gutter, and then he put the pack back inside the leather satchel his grandfather had carried it in, and he put the satchel against the wolf's good side so that she could smell it and would know it was his. He banked the lantern. He told the wolf, in a voice that surprised him by being a voice at all, that he would be back at first light with food and warm broth and clean cloth. He stepped out through the curtain of vines and into the blue dusk, and he walked the 1.5 miles home through snow he did not feel, and that night, for the first time in 3 years, he did not pour a tin cup of whiskey because he wanted, more than anything, to remember the next morning clearly. Through the rest of that long winter, the cave became the second room of Silas Marsh's life. He walked to it every dawn with a pack of food and bandages and oats and a slab of bacon, and he walked back at dusk, and in between he tended the wolf and watched her wound close from red to pink to silvered scar, and he sat against the cave wall with the lantern at his elbow and read his grandfather's journals page by careful page. He opened the sealed letter on the 3rd evening. It was 4 sheets long. It said in part that Caleb Marsh had taken sick in October of 1872, a wet cough, then a fever, then the slow gray weakening of pneumonia, and that he had taken refuge in this cave, which a Nez Perce hunter named Two Hawks had shown him in the spring as a place of shelter and good faith. It said that he had used his last 6 months and his last clear hours to finish the work he had started, a survey of the entire central Sawtooth Range that documented not only the mountain features the federal government wanted, but also the traditional Nez Perce trails, hunting grounds, and winter camps that the federal government had been systematically pretending did not exist. It said that he was leaving the work in this cave for the only person who he believed would ever find it, because he believed that the wolves and the river and the old drawings on the walls would find a Marsh again one day, and that Marsh would know what to do with what he found. It said, "I have been a long time dying in a warm place, with company I did not expect and would not trade. Do not grieve. Use the maps." It was signed in a hand grown weaker on the last page than on the first, "Your grandfather, Caleb." By the time the snow began to soften in the south-facing meadows in April, Silas Marsh had transcribed 280 pages of his grandfather's notes into a clean, fair copy in a bound ledger he had carried up from the cabin. He had redrawn every survey map in pencil and then in ink. He had cross-checked compass bearings against his own knowledge of the range, and where his grandfather's notes had said trail used by Two Hawks' people to winter camp, Silas had walked the line himself, on snowshoes, in the brief blue afternoons, and confirmed every bend. The wolf walked beside him on most of those trips, her shoulder healed to a stiff but functional joint, her 4 pups bounding fat and clumsy at her heels through the drifts. He had named none of them. He did not believe he had the right. On the last week of April, when the pass into Stanley opened, Silas Marsh came down out of the sawtooths for the first time in 18 months. He carried the bound ledger in an oilcloth wrap inside a satchel against his ribs. He carried his grandfather's original journals in a second satchel. He did not stop in Stanley. He kept walking 8 days on the pack trail with a borrowed mule down to Boise, to the Federal Land Office on Main Street, and he laid his grandfather's work on the Surveyor General's desk and told him, in a quiet voice that did not shake, what it was. The Surveyor General was an older man named Holloway who had known Caleb Marsh in life. He read for 2 hours without speaking. Then he stood up, walked around the desk, and shook Silas's hand for a long time without letting go. What followed took most of a year. There were affidavits. There were verifications. A small federal party rode up into the sawtooths in June and Silas led them, with the wolf trotting alongside, to the cave behind the curtain of vines. They photographed the drawings. They photographed the inscription. They left everything where it was. In Washington, Caleb Marsh's name was formally restored to the Federal Survey records of 1872, with full credit for the Central Sawtooth maps and for the documentation of the Nez Perce trails, documentation that, in the years that followed, would be used in 3 separate land claim hearings to confirm Nez Perce's traditional use of disputed valleys. The cave itself, by an order signed in the autumn of 1889, was registered on the territorial maps under the name Silas had requested, Marsh's Hollow. 3 years passed after that. Silas Marsh, at 52, ran a small mountain guide service out of his cabin on the south-facing shelf above the creek. He took summer parties up into the high country on 5-day and 7-day trips, hunters in the early season, surveyors and naturalists in the middle, a small but growing number of curious travelers in the late, and he led them with a working pack of 5 wolves at his heel. The mother, whose shoulder had healed to a permanent slight limp in cold weather, walked at his left knee and would not be persuaded to walk anywhere else. The 4 grown pups, 3 females and a male, all of them named now, all of them his fanned out ahead and behind on the trail, scouting, watching, doubling back, the way a good dog will do for a hunter, except that they were not dogs and never would be, and the difference mattered to Silas in a way he never fully explained to a paying client. He had become, without setting out to be, one of the most trusted backcountry men in central Idaho. The valley town below sent him their hardest mail, their lost hiker searches, their stubborn questions about where exactly the old trails ran. He had also, in the second of those 3 years, remarried. Her name was Leela. She was Nez Perce, the granddaughter of a woman named Quiet Water who had told her, when she was small, the story of a hidden cave behind a curtain of frozen vines on the limestone band of the Central Sawtooths, a cave where the old people had drawn the world, and where, her grandmother had said with a small careful smile, a white man with kind eyes had once been allowed to die in peace. Leela had come up to Stanley in the summer of 1890 to see the Surveyor General's report for herself, and she had asked, very politely, if the man who had brought it down might be willing to walk her to the place. Silas had walked her to the place. He had stood with her in the back of the cave, while she touched the charcoal lines on the wall with the tips of her fingers, and said 3 words very quietly in a language he did not know. He had walked her back down to the cabin. He had asked her, the following spring, if she would consider staying. They had 1 daughter. Her name was Hannah Quiet Water Marsh. She was 2 years old in the spring of 1893, and she rode on her father's hip up the trail to the cave once a month when the weather allowed, and she pulled the ears of the mother wolf without fear, and the mother wolf endured it with the same half-shut yellow patience she had once endured pine pitch on her shoulder. The river stone in the clearing east of the cabin still stood. Silas walked past it every morning. He did not always stop. But sometimes now he did, and sometimes he laid a hand on the stone, and sometimes he spoke a name out loud, and the wolves, who waited for him at the edge of the clearing, because they understood without being told that this ground was not their ground, watched him in their quiet half-shut way, and then they all walked on together. In the autumn of 1893, Silas Marsh donated his grandfather's 3 original journals, the Brass Compass, and the sealed letter to the Idaho Historical Society in Boise, where they remain to this day in a cedar case in the second-floor gallery, under a small brass plaque that reads simply, "The gift of Caleb and Silas Marsh, father and grandson, of the Sawtooth Range." And one dawn that same autumn, a gray, slow dawn, much like another dawn 5 years before, Silas Marsh pulled open his cabin door and stepped out onto his porch with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. The air smelled of frost and lodgepole pine, and old smoke from the bank stove. Beyond the door in the yard, 4 wolves sat on their haunches in the snow, waiting for him, the way they had waited for him every morning of every season for as long as any of them could remember. The mother sat a little apart, watching her grown children with the same yellow patience. They did not move when he stepped out. They did not need to. They had agreed long ago, all of them, on how this part of the day was supposed to go. Silas drank his coffee. He looked at the river stone in the clearing. He looked at the lintel above his door, where Hannah's name was carved, and where, beside it now in a smaller, newer hand, the words "and Leela" and "Hannah Quiet Water" had been added. He looked at the wolves. He raised his cup just slightly in their direction. Then he stepped down off the porch, and they rose to meet him, and together the man and his pack walked out into the morning toward whatever the mountains had to offer that day. A wounded wolf led him to his grandfather. He led others into the mountains. Some wounds heal the world,